So when I was growing up, I never heard of any idea that there was even an option to shower on Yom Tov. That was just like Yom Tov was no different than Shabbos as far as I was concerned. But maybe I've made the world a little bit more corrupt, I don't know. But anyway, it seems like showering on Yom Tov is a hot topic nowadays. And people find it very difficult, especially in hot weather, especially on a 2 or 3 day Yom Tov. It becomes a big deal. So for a long time, this has been on my bucket list to discuss. And spent many hours on it in the last few weeks. And what I decided is that actually I'm not going to talk about that today, but what we do today will be the introduction to that. So next time will be about showering on Yom Tov. And today we're going to talk about a more generic using hot water on Yom Tov. Just using the hot water faucet to wash your hands, to wash dishes, or anything like that. And then hopefully next time we'll move on to bathing, showering, etc. So also if anybody's not here now, I'll post in the group, whatever it is, to please try and make the time sometime between now and then to listen to the recording. Before I talk about Yom Tov, I'm just going to cover something very basic about Shabbos. When it comes to Shabbos, there's 39 types of malachas, 39 types of forbidden labor activity, which are biblically forbidden. Now, there are all sorts of different criteria that go into any given act to determine whether or not this is biblically forbidden, or is there some element missing and it's downgraded and it's only forbidden on a rabbinic level. So there's all sorts of terms for this. There's grama, there's davar she'eino miskaven, there's malacha she'eino tzricha legufa, there's psik resha. We're not going to get into all of what those things mean, but the point is that often you have indirect cause and effect, which the poskim grapple with determining exactly, is this indirect enough to downgrade it to a rabbinic level prohibition, and in some cases it's even good enough to it's so indirect that it's good enough to downgrade it to be perfectly permissible. So for example, of course, in Shabbos, you wouldn't go and change the setting on your thermostat to change to air conditioning, right? But you would open the front door and walk in, even though that while you do that, you're introducing new warm air into the house, which has an impact on the thermostat, and that might activate the air conditioning. But obviously, that's allowed, and the reason why it's allowed is because that's considered indirect enough. Similarly, opening the refrigerator. There are some poskim, and I actually know people, when I was growing up, it wasn't so uncommon that people were machmir, that they only opened the refrigerator while the motor was running. And I actually remember an uncle of mine who used to keep a towel on the refrigerator the whole Shabbos so that the door would never close properly the whole Shabbos, and that was a way of ensuring that the refrigerator didn't have a very long life. No, I mean that they were allowed to open it on Shabbos. Right? But the common practice is that we do open refrigerators on Shabbos, even though, of course, not if there's a light on, because that would be considered a direct, even though it's not your intention to turn on the light, but that's a direct result of opening the door. But barring a light, we do open the refrigerator on Shabbos, even though there's the possibility that it's going to activate the motor, not just a possibility, it's a definite eventuality that the more warm air goes into the fridge, the sooner the motor is going to be activated. Now, there was a Rav in Poland named Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Frimmer, otherwise known as the Kozha Glover Rav. Now, everybody in this room is a 3 times removed from the Kozha Glover Rav, because Rabbi Epstein was a student of Rabbi Pekarsky, who was a Rosh Hashiva in 770, and Rabbi Pekarsky was a student of the Kozha Glover Rav. So not so distant from us. So in the Tshuva Sefer of the Kozha Glover Rav in Eretz Tzvi, Simon Kuf Yud Beis, he says this is a Tshuva written by the Kozha Glover Rav to Rabbi Pekarsky, and Rabbi Pekarsky, as at the time, he's addressing him as the Rav of Geneva. I was not able to find any other documentation of Rabbi Pekarsky serving as Rav in Geneva. I know he married a granddaughter of the Geneva Rav, so maybe he was just living there at the time. There's no date on the Tshuva, but basically it's addressed to Rabbi Pekarsky. And Rabbi Pekarsky had addressed a letter to the Kozha Glover Rav asking him that there's this new invention over here, which is that we have a big vat, a big tank on top of the oven, which is full of boiling hot water. And it's connected to the pipes that bring the water to the building. and this heating system in the bathhouse, it heats up this big barrel of water. Now, what happens is when you open up the faucet and hot water comes out of the big barrel. This is in your source sheets, whatever. I'm reading it from the Hebrew, but you could see just the first paragraph I screenshot of the Shuvah on page 5. You could see where it says, "The Talmidi to my student, Rabbi, I think it's Yud. I think his name was Yisrael Yitzchak or something like that. Pekarsky, Rav B'Geneva." Yeah. So he says when you open the faucet and hot water comes out of your big barrel, so automatically that activates the system that new water comes in from the reservoir, from the supply, to fill up the original bucket. And obviously, because you have a little bit of water mixing with a lot of hot water, so instantaneously that cold water becomes hot. So are you allowed to use, this was the Shaila, are you allowed to use this on Shabbos? Am I responsible for the cold water being introduced into this big vat and becoming hot? Or can that somehow be considered something that's not my intention and indirect enough to be permissible, or at least to only be forbidden rabbinically on Shabbos? That is the Shaila that Rabbi Pekarsky asked Rabbi Frimer, and then Rabbi Frimer goes on for quite a number of pages analyzing this question and bringing all sorts of proofs from different places in the Gemara where he tries to address this question. Now, of course, hopefully, this new invention that Rabbi Pekarsky has described, it's unclear to me why he was so desperate to allow it. Maybe it had to do with the mikvah, with being allowed to have warm water in the mikvah on Shabbat. I'm not sure exactly what the context was, but hopefully this new invention that he's described shouldn't sound too dissimilar to you than the regular boiler that all of us have in our homes, which is we open the hot water, you take out hot water from the faucet, and new cold water is introduced into the boiler. So, amongst the various proofs that the Kosher Glover Rav brings in this topic, and the Kosher Glover Rav himself, actually, interestingly, is more leaning toward downgrading it to a rabbinic prohibition, although at the end he says, it seems right, but I'm not 100% sure, so don't do it, but maybe ask a guy to do it. He's not so definitive about it. But I want to go through with you one of the proofs that he brings. So if you look on page 5 of your sources, I've brought here a Mishnah it's a Mishnah in Shabbos. The Mishnah relates a story about the people of the city of Tiberias. Now, what's relevant about Tiberias, Tveria, is that you have the hot springs over there. Now, hot springs are very hot, but they're not fire. There's no fire there. And so cooking with the heat of the hot springs is not a biblical prohibition. It's only a rabbinic prohibition. Okay, so these people had a kunz. What did they wanted to be able to have hot water on Shabbos. So what did they do? They ran a cold water pipe, called a silon, through a canal of hot water from the hot springs of Tveria, and they thought that by doing so they could heat cold water on Shabbos. Yep. So the rabbi said to them, no, this is a mistake, you cannot do this. If the water passed through this hot system on Shabbos, its status is like the hot water that was heated on Shabbos, and water is prohibited for bathing and for drinking. If it was on Yom Tov, then it's permissible to drink, but forbidden for bathing. Okay, so basically they had made some contraption to heat the hot water on Shabbos. Biblically, there was no prohibition because there was no fire involved. Rabbinically, the rabbi said, no, this is no good. Now, what exactly was going on over here? What exactly were they doing over here? This is what was the exact nature of this contraption? So, there's a number of different opinions in the commentaries in the Gemara, but Tosfos suggests, one of the suggestions in Tosfos says like this, this is not in your source sheet, if we were to interpret the story, that this pipe that they put in the through the Tveria hot springs had holes in it, and when they opened the pipe to get out the hot water that had become hot from sitting in the Tveria water, new cold water was introduced into the pipe. So then it would make a lot of sense, as Tosfos, because then you're only one step removed from a biblical prohibition. In other words, what's Tosfos saying? That if you have a pipe of water going through, if you have a pipe of hot water, when you open the hot water, automatically cold water is introduced. So then, if it would be fire, that would be a biblical prohibition. Because it's not fire, it's only the hot springs of Tveria, so therefore it's only a rabbinic prohibition. right? And the emphasis in Tosfos is that in this case of the pipe with Teria, it's only one step removed from the biblical prohibition. In other words, the only thing that makes it not biblically forbidden is the fact that it's not fire; it's the natural hot springs. So the Kajik Rav says, you see, this is the exact same case as the boiler system. You have hot water. You're opening the hot water system, which automatically introduces cold water. What are you trying to argue, that maybe that's considered indirect enough that it would only be a rabbinic prohibition? No, you see clearly from this Tosfos that that would constitute a biblical prohibition. Okay, now, like I mentioned, the Kajik Rav himself at the end still, he says, he brings other proofs and he tries to push it in the other direction. But there is a tshuva from Rabbi Yosef, one of the most prominent poskim of our generation. Very, very long tshuva, as most of his tshuvas are. And he really likes this raya from the Kajik Rav, and he says that he refers to it as a raya mehemna, which is obviously a borrowed phrase. We say raya mehemna with an ayin, which means the faithful shepherd, and he's changed it to an aleph, which means the faithful proof. Right? So we have the faithful proof. He says this is the biggest proof that yes, indeed, removing hot water from the boiler, turning on your hot water faucet on Shabbos, is a biblical prohibition of cooking, because you're introducing new cold water into the boiler, which becomes hot instantaneously. That is a biblical prohibition, says Rabbi Yosef, based on this Tosfos and the tshuva of the Kajik Rav. Now, similarly, there is a tshuva from Moshe Feinstein, where he also says that somebody asked him if he's allowed to use, again, I didn't check what year Moshe Feinstein wrote this, but it seemed that this is obviously, something which nowadays everybody knows. Oh, no, for sure you can't do that. But in those days, people were still figuring these things out. They were still new. And he said, no, absolutely, I know of no heter whatsoever to use the hot water in your kitchen, in your faucet on Shabbos. And from his language over there, that it's a psikresha, and he thinks it is miskavan. If I'm understanding Moshe Feinstein correctly, he's saying that it's not just that you're not allowed to use the hot water on Shabbos, but that it's biblically forbidden. And one more very important source is from a Sefer Shvus Yitzchak, volume 6, page 91, where he quotes, Shvus Yitzchak is many volumes, it's like 15 volumes or so, and he quotes over there from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, also, and again, we're going to be talking about Shlomo Zalman Auerbach quite a bit today, but he is, besides being one of the important contemporary poskim, he's also one who is most often, or very often, cited whenever it comes to questions of sort of modern technology and applying halacha to it. And he also seems to be saying that it's biblically forbidden to turn on the hot water on Shabbos. Okay? So obviously we're not here to talk about Shabbos as much as we are to talk about Yom Tov, but you'll see soon how this is a fundamental introduction to the whole topic, that using the hot water faucet on Shabbos is, according to three very prominent contemporary poskim who are accepted and who we use their rulings in all areas of modern technology, etc., and Moshe Feinstein, Rabbi Yosef, and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach all seem to be saying that this is a biblical prohibition. Now, let's move on to understanding a little bit the halachas of Yom Tov and how to apply all of this to Yom Tov. I was hoping to go through with you inside the primary things that we need to do in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. I realize that that's going to take much too long, so I'm going to say it outside, but I do encourage you, when you review or whatever, take these papers home and do try to read it inside, and again, I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards that come up. Concerning Yom Tov, the pasuk says, Kol meleches avodah lo yisasu. You're not allowed to do meleches avodah, which means labor, but it's different than the phrase the Torah uses about Shabbos, where it's kol melacha. Meleches avodah is a little bit different. And then in another pasuk it says, things to do with food are allowed. And so we have this principle, and try and pay attention to this chart in the beginning of your source sheet, where I have these 5 different phrases in Hebrew. As I go along, I'm going to be explaining these phrases as we go along. So the first phrase is meleches oichel nefesh, labor with food. That is permissible on Yom Tov. You're allowed to cook, you're allowed to bake, you're allowed to knead a dough, you're allowed to shecht an animal if you're so inclined. There's all things to do with food that you are allowed to do on Yom Tov. Now, I'm not going to get into it now, but just it's important to emphasize, not everything that's to do with food is allowed to do on Yom Tov. There are things that are rabbinically forbidden. We're not going to get into that now, but just important to know that it's not a clear-cut rule, but for the purpose of now, melacha seichel nefesh means labor or work or malacha that you do with food, and that is permissible to do on Yom Tov. Try to remember the words. I'm going to hopefully be using only the Hebrew words as we go along in the class. So that's the first one, melacha seichel nefesh. Then, melacha seichel nefesh is permissible on Yom Tov. Now, there is a concept called mitoich. Mitoich is the third one in the list, which is expanding the allowance beyond food. Now, mitoich is just one word, which is, remember last time we had the word hoel, which was which was just a code word for a whole long sentence. So here we have the same thing. Mitoich is a code word for mitoich shehutra l'tzorech hutra shalei l'tzorech. And what that means is that these types of work that are permissible for food, because once the Torah already allowed them for food, therefore we already allowed them for non-food related things, provided that those things are tzorech hashav l'chol nefesh. It has to be a somewhat necessity for Yom Tov, and it has to be a universal necessity, not something that only the elite class needs, something that most people need. Is permissible on Yom Tov. So, for example, digging a pit, that's not something that would be allowed to, that has anything to do with food. You don't dig pits to get food, so you're not allowed to dig a pit on Yom Tov in any situation. But lighting a fire, not creating a new fire, but expanding an existing fire, is something that you often do in the process of preparing food, and therefore you're allowed to do it for other needs as well. So if you're cold and you want to warm yourself up, and back in the way you did that was you lit some sort of bonfire, or you lit a fire in your chimney, in your fireplace. So that would be permissible on Yom Tov, even though warming yourself up is not a food item. But because warming yourself up is considered a universal need, it's a tzorech hashav l'chol nefesh. So that is permissible to do on Yom Tov. Right? So we have melacha seichel nefesh, that's permissible on Yom Tov, and then we expand it to other things beyond food, other universal needs. You're allowed to do those very same melachas once they were, right? That's why, for example, if you're going somewhere for the Seder, you could carry your matzah. You're allowed to carry your haggadah as well. The answer is yes, because you are allowed to carry food, so we also allow you to carry also other things which are not food. Okay, that's mitoch. And we've also, so actually, as it turns out, we've already explained 4 out of the 5 phrases in the Hebrew over here. We've explained the first one, melacha seichel nefesh. We've explained the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Mitoich, expanding the allowance. Shar tzorchei haguf means other universal bodily needs. Shav l'chol nefesh is the emphasis on the fact that they are universal needs, not something that just some people want. I don't think we're going to have time to get into it today, but one of the big sugyas on Yom Tov once upon a time was, is it permissible to smoke on Yom Tov? And a big part of the discussion was, obviously smoking is lighting a fire or expanding a fire, etc. So is smoking considered a universal need? Just because of some people who enjoy it, is it considered universal? And smoking on Yom Tov is a big topic, which I don't think there's any need to get into now. And also, obviously, the question is whether nowadays, whether those poskim who allowed it once upon a time would still allow it nowadays is another question. We're not going to get into all of that now. The final thing on the list, which is the second one, is machshirei eichel nefesh. Now, machshirei eichel nefesh, and you will see I even put this as a little note in the beginning, we present this as a binary. You have eichel nefesh and you have machshirei eichel nefesh. The fact is that it's far from being clear-cut, and to try and explain all the different stories and rulings in the Gemara and the Poskim into this neat classification of Eichel Nefesh and Mechshir Eichel Nefesh is a very difficult task to do. And many Poskim acknowledge this explicitly and discuss different, to try and make this spectrum of Eichel Nefesh and Mechshir Eichel Nefesh. But for the purposes of our class right now, we're just going to treat this as a binary system, which is more or less what the Alter Rebbe does. The Alter Rebbe certainly presents it as such, even though one could, we can analyze some texts of the Alter Rebbe and see if he himself also recognizes some differences. But for the most part, we're going to present this as a binary. What's the binary? You have melacha seichel nefesh, that we've discussed until now, and machshirei eichel nefesh. Machshirei eichel nefesh is things that are in the process of preparing food, but they're not directly with the food. You're not touching the food. It's something that you would do removed from the food. So, for example, the example that the Alter Rebbe talks about the most when he presents it is preparing, fixing, creating a spit. A spit is like a big stick where you put the meat on to roast it. So now you need a spit in order to be able to roast. You can't roast without it. But nevertheless, that's machshirei eichel nefesh. That's indirect labor with the food, and that is forbidden to do on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do machshirei eichel nefesh on Yom Tov. Important to point out that even though it doesn't seem to fit with the categories I've explained until now, but let's read this inside. If you open to page, the very top of page 2, all right. Similarly, making a fire is placed in this category of regular eichel nefesh. One might think that although it is performed for the sake of eating, for one makes a fire with food and cooks on it, but since it's not performed with the food itself, it should only be considered a preparatory act of machshirei eichel nefesh and not melachas eichel nefesh. Nevertheless, no, since through fire one makes the food fit to be eaten, and the fire when kindled or increases makes the food fit to be eaten by cooking it, this activity is included in the category of melachas eichel nefesh. Okay, so I don't know that we need. We could question this and try to further understand it better, but for now, let's just accept what the Alter Rebbe tells us, that lighting a fire to cook your food on, and again, I'm not talking about starting a new fire, that's another topic, but let's just say making the existing fire bigger. That is, even though you're not eating the fire, of course, but that is direct enough that it is considered eichel nefesh. But besides for fire, other things that are not directly with the food that you're eating, which is, like, again, let's use the example of fixing a spit, that is called machshirei eichel nefesh, and that is forbidden on Yom Tov. However, there are a number of exceptions when machshirei eichel nefesh would be permissible. First of all, if there was no opportunity to do so before Yom Tov. Now, when we say no opportunity to do so before Yom Tov, we're not just saying, oh, you were busy on Erev Yom Tov, because, okay, you could have done it a month ago. Don't tell me you don't have a spit because you didn't have time yesterday. You could have bought or made a spit a month ago. But what happens if you did have a spit yesterday and it broke today? It broke on Yom Tov. So then we say, oh, now you could do it on Yom Tov. Because you couldn't, because you had no possibility of doing it before Yom Tov, then we will allow you to do machshirin on Yom Tov. However, there are a number of very important caveats to this, and essentially the way we look at it is that eichel nefesh, melachas eichel nefesh, is permissible on Yom Tov. We're not trying to avoid it, we're not trying to get out of it, it's permissible. There's no hesitation to allow you to make a scrambled egg on Yom Tov. When it comes to melachas eichel nefesh, to machshirei eichel nefesh, even though we're saying that if you had a spit before Yom Tov and it only broke today, it's permissible, but we're not really comfortable with that, and we're going to go to whatever extremes we can to make you not do it. I'm not going to go through all the limitations to it, but I'll just mention the main ones. The main ones are like this. First of all, only if there's no other option. In other words, when it comes to regular eichel nefesh, you want to make a scrambled egg, you want to have a hard-boiled egg. We don't tell you, like, okay, well, before you make it, go see maybe your neighbor already has an egg you could borrow that's already cooked. No, you want to cook the egg, you go and cook an egg on Yom Tov. There's no hesitation to it. When it comes to machshirei eichel nefesh, so for example, your spit broke today and suddenly you're stuck without a way to roast your meat. So before we allow you to do it, we're going to tell you first go see if any of the neighbors have a spit you could borrow. Another example is that, let's say without doing machshirei eichel nefesh, your bread is going to be charred. Because there's ashes in the oven. It's a whole long scenario that Alter Rebbe explains. It's in, if you want to write it down and look it up later, it's in Siman Tov Kuf Tes, I think, 509, towards the beginning. So he says, it doesn't matter. We're not going to allow you to do machshirei eichel nefesh just because your bread is going to come out a bit charred. You could bake a bread, it's going to be edible. No, we're not going to allow you to do machshirei eichel nefesh. If you had no option, your mom is not going to have any bread, so then we'll allow you to do it. But just because the bread is going to come out a bit charred, that's not an excuse to allow machshirei eichel nefesh. Another very important caveat, and this is a little bit of a, I don't want to use the word strange, but it's somewhat of a difficult concept to grasp or to come to terms with, and that is that this is a secret. You're not allowed to tell it to anybody. Halacha v'ein morin kein. If you come to me on Yom Tov and tell me my spit just broke, can I fix it? I have to tell you no. I'm not allowed to divulge this information to you. Not only am I not allowed to divulge this information to you, I'm not even allowed to do it while you might be watching me. It's a secret that only, I don't know who, I guess only learned people who learn Shulchan Aruch know it. And and we're not allowed to spread this news. And obviously the reason is, again, I acknowledge it's a difficult concept to understand, but this all goes to show how, even though there are cases where there's allowances for machshirin, we're very hesitant to use it, and we keep it a secret because we don't want people to abuse the allowance. If you want to see that inside, look on page. It's the bottom. It's 509. If you look, it's page 3, the bottom of page 3, and the top of page 4. That's where you have this idea that you're not allowed to tell anybody, and you're not allowed to do it in front of anybody who might learn from you, etc. Okay. So later you could look it up. I want to keep on moving right now to try and cover everything we have to cover. Okay. One more very important thing. Mitoich. Remember I told you before, mitoich, what does mitoich mean? That we expand the allowance. So because you're allowed to light a fire to cook your food, so you're allowed to use the allowance for Eichel Nefesh for non-food related items as well. That concept, mitoich, that you expand it to non-food needs, does not apply to machshir Eichel Nefesh. You're never allowed to do machshir Eichel Nefesh if it's not directly to do with food. And the example of this, the most obvious and easy example of it, is extinguishing a candle in a couple's bedroom, right? So the halacha is that when a husband and wife want to be intimate, there's not supposed to be a light on. So what do you do if there's a candle in the room and the scenario is that there's no other place to move the candle to? You have no way of covering it. You have no right. It's not in the source sheet. I think I mentioned it in a footnote, but I didn't have it in English to put in. So your options are either you could extinguish the candle or you have to abstain. So for a husband and wife to be intimate, that is a legitimate universal need. So that would be allowed. That would be something which would be allowed on Yom Tov. So like, I don't know, if it was too cold in the room, they could light a fire to warm themselves up. That would be fine. But they cannot extinguish the candle. Why not? Because extinguishing the candle, that's machshirin. That's not the item that they're using, which in that case just means themselves. But it's an external item, and it's machshirin. So machshirin, even within the cases where it would be permissible that there was no option to do it beforehand, etc., 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 it only applies to food. So, for example, in certain limited situations, you would be allowed to fix your spit on Yom Tov if it broke today, but it doesn't apply to non-food things such as extinguishing a candle in the couple's bedroom. All right, so just to summarize very briefly everything we've said so far, it's basically a chart on page 4. Eichel Nefesh, Machshir Eichel Nefesh. Eichel Nefesh is, even if it could have been done prior to Yom Tov, you could still do it on Yom Tov usually. There are some exceptions to this rule, and some people nowadays want to say that now that we have refrigeration and we could cook everything before Yom Tov and keep it fresh, maybe we should be more limited in what we do on Yom Tov. Whatever, we're not going to get into that right now. And also, Eichel Nefesh may be done even for non-food items as long as they're universal needs, whereas Machshir Eichel Nefesh may only be done if it wasn't possible beforehand, and etc. We take that very extremely. If you have any way to borrow it from a friend or any other workaround, even if it's not a very convenient workaround because your bread is still going to be a bit charred, it doesn't matter, we don't allow you to do it. Keep this information to yourself, don't tell it to anybody, and of course it only applies to food, not to other things. Now, yes?
If the pit's not dug for the firewood to cook, to light, are you allowed to dig the pit? Or is it considered like the spit?
Digging the pit, if I recall correctly, was never going to be allowed on Yom Tov.
Uh-huh.
If I recall correctly, I could be wrong, but again, if you want to see all the details and all the examples, you have to go through the whole Siman Tov Tzadikei 495 in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and it goes through many more examples in the continuation of that Siman. Okay. Now, what's another example of a bodily need? So before we spoke, for example, about when you're cold to light a fire. Another example is, let's see this inside in the bottom of page 4 from section 511. It was already explained in section 495 that since kindling a fire was permitted for the sake of preparing food, that act is also permitted for purposes other than preparing food, provided that the fire will be necessary for the festival in some way. So it has to be a universal need for the festival. For this reason, it is permitted to make a large fire with which to warm oneself. Okay, we said that. or to warm a small amount of water to use to wash one's face, hands, and feet on a festival. So again, washing your hands, face, and feet in warm water is considered a universal need, and therefore it is permissible to warm a small amount of water to be allowed to do on Yom Tov. However, it is prohibited to warm a large amount of water to use to wash one's entire body, which of course that's going to be the topic of next class to figure out when we're talking about showering and bathing on Yom Tov. Yes?
So the small amount of water warmed nowadays means you can use the warm water in your faucet?
Oh, you're jumping the gun. We're going to get there.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah. So first we have to get the terms from Shulchan Aruch clear, right?
Sorry.
Now, so now that's really the next place to go, actually, right? So now it's 8:30 already. Now the question we have to address is, what is the deal with turning on the hot water faucet on Yom Tov? Now, this is a question that has bothered me I remember clearly where and when I started dealing with this. I was 15 years old, or 14 years old in class, and I bought this new sefer, which since has been reprinted in an edition double the size, and I tracked down the sources to this. And if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, am I allowed to use the warm water to wash my dishes on Yom Tov, I probably would have shrugged my shoulders and said, yeah, Rabbi Shimon says it's okay, I don't really get it, but yeah, people do that. But today I'm going to ruin that for you because I don't think you are allowed to do that on Yom Tov, but hear me out. Most of the poskim who talk about this, what they're concerned about is the fact, how does a boiler work? Again, there's different boilers. The old poskim are talking about a gas boiler with a pilot light. Nowadays you also have gas boilers with an igniter, with no pilot light. You also have electric boilers. But all of those three types of, let's just actually summarize all the types of boilers. There are boilers like you have in a huge building, if anybody's in Winston Towers, for example, where there's 300 units, 250 units, and I don't know exactly how it works, but there you're constantly using hot water. There's constantly new water being introduced into the boiler, and you turning on the hot water faucet isn't doing anything to the boiler. And that hot water, for example, in Winston Towers is taka okay to use on Yom Tov. Not on Shabbos, and Shabbos there's other issues involved, but on Yom Tov it would be okay. Then there's also what's called a dud shemesh, which is, there's two types of dudei shemesh, which basically is a water tank which is heated from the sun. They, to my knowledge, and they're very common in Israel, but they don't exist over here, and we don't need to talk about them. The only thing that's useful for me about Dud Shemesh is that I think that the reason why so many poskim are quiet about these issues is because the poskim who live in Eretz Yisrael are not so concerned with it because they're dealing with Dudei Shemesh, which are much less problematic on Yom Tov or on Shabbos for that matter. And then finally you also have instant boilers, which is there's no tank, it could be gas or electric, but either way you turn on hot water and that activates a big fire or a big heating which heats up the water pretty much instantaneously. That is absolutely forbidden on Yom Tov. There's nobody who allows it. That's not even a question. Then those instant boilers are not very common, at least in Chicago. Certainly residential construction, very rarely in Chicago. From what I've been able to determine, those are not very common. So most people, if you have a home in this neighborhood, you're going to have either an electric boiler or a gas boiler, either with a pilot or with igniter, whatever it is. Now, the way those things work is that there's a thermostat that's set to a certain temperature, and basically there's a little bit of a spectrum. So it says, okay, we're going to heat this tank until the thermostat reaches, we're going to make up a number, 120 degrees. And then once the water temperature drops below, let's say 110 degrees, it's going to reactivate it, bring it back up to 120, and then take a rest, etc. That's basically how all of those boilers work. And so most of the poskim who are talking about using hot water on Yom Tov, they're saying, oh, well, when you turn on the hot water, you're introducing cold water into the boiler. That automatically makes the temperature in the boiler drop, which then causes the thermostat to be activated and to reheat. So is that a problem on Yom Tov? And of course, when you turn off the hot water, then you have the opposite problem, that you're now stopping the flow of cold water coming in, which is causing the thermostats to be closer to its goal and therefore turn off or turn off soon or whatever it is. And all of these things are not really very concerning on Yom Tov. They're like we spoke before about Grumma, they're pretty much indirect. You never know for sure. It's possible that it's possible when you're turning on hot water, the happens to be right now the fire is on anyway, because just a minute ago the temperature dropped. And there's so many variables, it's so indirect, that's not really a problem. Now, for example, there's a tshuva here I didn't bring my copy with it, but there's a tshuva from the Ber Moshe. The Ber Moshe Stern, the Debreciner Rav, he lived in, pretty sure he lived in Borough Park. And he writes absolutely, very forcefully, absolutely no problem at all using the hot water on Yom Tov, and anybody who says so doesn't understand how the boiler system works. And to be honest, I was quite unimpressed reading his tshuva. First of all, because it's not clear to me that he understands exactly how it works. He's talking about a pilot, which is possible this was written in the 60s, that's what everybody had. But the way he describes it, he doesn't seem to be aware of the fact that sometimes the thermostat is activated regardless of new cold water being... He doesn't seem to really get the full picture. But most importantly, he's missing the whole issue which we started off with today, and that is that nothing to do with the thermostat at all. If you have a big barrel of 50 gallons of boiling hot water, when I say boiling hot, I don't mean literally 212 degrees bubbling hot. I just mean that it's... Halachically, we're concerned with Yatzila display, which, whatever exactly that is, 115 degrees, 120 degrees, whatever it is, but it's very hot water. When you have a vat of 50 gallons of hot water, and then you take a cup of hot water, that equivalent cup of cold water that is now introduced into the boiler is going to become Yatzila display instantaneously. And as we said before in the very outset, that it's clear both from Bavad Yosef, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that is considered an act of bishul, that is cooking. Right? And so, the question is, which the Ber Moshe, like I said, seems to be completely oblivious of, how could you ever use hot water on Yom Tov? When you, let's say I want to have, I think a very common example, which is 100% Eichel Nefesh, is you have a baby bottle of milk or formula, which it's in the fridge, and you have to take off the chill. How do you do that? You put in a cup of, thing of hot water, and you put the bottle in, you sit it there for 5 minutes, let it sit for 5 minutes, and then it becomes the right temperature for the baby, right? Now, when I take out hot water from the faucet, I haven't cooked any hot water. That water was already cooked before I started, right? What have I done? I've cooked a cup of hot water that's now introduced into the boiler. Now that cup of hot water that I've just cooked, I'm not using on Yom Tov. Not only am I not using it on Yom Tov, I'm not even using it now, because the way the boiler works is that if your boiler is not broken, the way it's designed to work is that the pipe of the cold water goes all the way down to the bottom of the boiler. So the cold water that comes in is mixed into the bottom of the boiler, and when you extract and you remove hot water, it comes out from the top of the boiler. So, and obviously cold water remains at the bottom. That's why it's designed this way, to make sure the thermostat keeps everything on track, right? If you're having a problem maintaining enough hot water in your house, I've been told that it's often because that pipe that takes the cold water all the way down to the bottom is broken, and the thermostat gets all confused because of that. So the cold water stays at the bottom, and it's only once it becomes warmed up that it. So you're not using that water which you cook on Yom Tov. You're not using it now. So how could, this was the problem, that when I was, again, 14, 15 years old, I was like, well, 1 second, how could you possibly use cold water on Yom Tov, hot water on Yom Tov? You're introducing cold water, which you're not using. And especially if it's the end of the day, there isn't even an option to use it on Yom Tov. So,
But you're cooking it.
you're cooking it, but you're only allowed to cook things that you need on Yom Tov. You don't need that water. What you need on Yom Tov is the water that you've removed from the faucet. The new water that you've introduced into the boiler, you have no use for that right now.
Which is why you should cook it.
So that's my question. Is there any basis to be allowed to turn on hot water on Yom Tov? That's my question, right?
So like in your hot water pot that you have that only has, let's say, 30 cups in it, you should wait till it goes all the way down to make sure you're going to use all the new water that you put in? Is it like similar?
No. There's two things to say about that. Number one, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov. That doesn't mean you have to track exactly how much you need. You try. Okay, I think I need a pot of water. Obviously, you might. Part of your need is to have enough that you don't need to, start measuring ounces. But this wouldn't necessarily work with adding water to a hot water urn. But there are cases where it would work, which was what we discussed 2 classes ago, about doing a lot in one act, right? So if you fill up the pot of water and then you put the whole pot on the fire, then you could put as much as you want, because it's one act of cooking. That wouldn't work to adding water to the kettle, or adding water to the boiler for that matter, because it's already on the fire. It's all right now. You're doing a malacha. There, you're putting the water into a pot which is off the fire, so there's no malacha involved, and then there's one malacha, placing the pot onto the fire. But the short answer is right. If you know that you only need a maximum of 10 cups, then you shouldn't put 20 cups worth of water into your urn. Now, you don't know if you need 10 cups or 9 cups or 8 cups, so then you could put in 10 cups because you might need them. That's fine. But here, the new water that's being introduced to the boiler, you know for sure that you're not using it now. And in some cases, you know for sure that you're not using it on Yom Tov.
Does it matter what the temperature is?
What the temperature of the water in the boiler is?
I mean, the temperature of the boiler is never Yatzilis, though.
The temperature in the boiler is always Yatzila display. It's when the water that you extract from your faucet is not, because you're not putting it all the way, well, always, it depends on the settings, but most houses, from what I spoke to David Zirkin, he knows. But in most houses, the boiler is definitely set to Yatzila display. And when you set your faucet, especially nowadays where we almost never have a hot and a cold faucet, you have one where the two mix. You set it to the temperature that in my house there's no 100%. If I put the faucet in the kitchen on only hot setting, it's going to be more than Yatzila display, 100%. Right? But you're making a very valid point, which I'm going to get to soon, is about adjusting your boiler. But I don't want to jump ahead. It's 8:43. Keeping track of time over here. Okay. So, there is a sefer called Shmira Shabbos Kol Chasa. Shmira Shabbos Kol Chasa is a very well-known, possibly the most well-known sefer in Hilchos Shabbos, written by Rav Neubert, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Rav Neubert was a very close disciple of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who we mentioned before, and there are many, many rulings from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach that our access to them is the fact that they are recorded, that there were conversations that he had with Rav Neubert, who then recorded them in Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa. So Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa, he asks this question. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says, I don't think this is in your source sheet, but it should be in my source sheet. Hold on. Yeah, there it is. Says, even if you're taking out a little bit of water right before Yom Tov, so it's not even possible to be using it on Yom Tov, nevertheless, it's okay. Why? Because it's impossible to extract hot water unless cold water goes in its place. We could consider that to be tzorech eichel nefesh. Right? We could consider that to be eichel nefesh. That's what Rav Shlomo Zalman says. He writes at the end, calls it, it's a whole long thing. I'll just read to you one sentence of it. All of this I heard from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Right? This is the exact same footnote that I read 20-something years ago and baffled me and has continued to baffle me till this day. How does this make any sense? And again, this is in some cases, this is a biblical prohibition. If it's towards the end of Yom Tov where you don't have hoil, there isn't even a theoretical possibility of using it today. Remember what hoil means, right? Mm-hmm. So just with such a svara, because you have no other way of doing it, so therefore it's allowed. I mean, it seems like quite a audacious statement to make. And over the years, I can't say I've done any extensive research, but it's always baffled me, and whenever the topic has come up, I've often asked people and sort of got shrugged shoulders, yeah, I don't know, whatever. Okay. Now, I mean, also, his statement that there's no other way to do it, well, is that true that there's no other way to do it? First of all, you could adjust the setting. What are the other options? So first of all, another option is that you could adjust the setting on your boiler that it should be set to 100 degrees, so it will be warm but not hot. Another option you could do, and again, this depends on exactly the weather and a 1 day or 2 day or 3 day Yom Tov, but you could just switch off the boiler before Yom Tov, and for the first few hours of Yom Tov you'll have hot water, later you'll have warm or lukewarm water, but you could just switch it off. Thirdly, and maybe you need to know a little bit about appliances before you try this at home or ask a plumber for advice, but in theory, it's not a big deal to just shut off the valve that allows from the main of the water into the boiler, and that's it. You have a tank of whatever, a tank of boiler is 50, 60, 70 gallons. That's usually enough hot water for Yom Tov, and that's it. You don't introduce any. Now again, I don't know, don't try this without getting professional advice. I don't know if what impact that could have on the boiler, but I'm just saying it's not even true to say that there is no other option. There are other. That might not be the most convenient other options, but there definitely are other options. Okay, so this is the question. How are we going to allow using hot water on Yom Tov? Now this year, so now I finally looked into it, and I saw that actually I'm not so crazy for having these problems. First of all, the very statement from Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach recorded in Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa is recorded differently in other places with a much less permissive tone. It's not in front. No, it's not in front of me right now. But in that sefer that I mentioned to you before from Shvus Yitzchak, there he also had direct. He was also close to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach writes an introduction to a letter to one of his books. He clearly knew him well. And over there, I don't have it in front of me, but over there he. Oh, I do have it. It's right here. Yeah. He brings it much less. He doesn't give this as a blanket allowance that you could use the hot water on Yom Tov and not worry about the new water you're introducing, because Shlomo Zalman over here, the way he records it, it's another thing. He says because you can use it now, but then he says, but it's not true, because like I said before, the cold water goes to the bottom, the hot water goes to the top. And again, he has here a whole number of pages, the Shvus Yitzchak. It's also page 96 of, I think it's volume 6 of Shvus Yitzchak. A whole number of pages going through, very analyzing from all sides, and he's not very, at the end of it, he doesn't really allow very much usage of hot water on Yom Tov. Maybe if we have time, I'll go through a little bit more detail of what he says. He says here in the footnote that I explicitly asked from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is the fact that when you remove water because you need the hot water, there's no other way to do it other than the fact that other water would be coming in. He said no. He said that wouldn't yet. No, that's not a good enough heter. So he's quoting Shlomo Zalman Auerbach himself as saying that's not good enough heter, because, and he says it's a good proof. He says there's a proof that when you're not allowed to take out oil, if you need oil and you have oil in your candle, you're not allowed to remove the oil because you're extinguishing or you're making the candle become extinguished earlier. So even though you need the oil, you're using the oil to fry your eggs with, but because there's no other way to get oil other than bringing the extinguishing of the candle, so it would not be allowed. So you see, yeah. So first of all, my first point that I'm making is that this heter that the Shmir Shabbos Kol Chos, and like I said, Shmir Shabbos Kol Chos is a much more popular, well-known sefer than the Shvus Yitzchak. So this version of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman's ruling has become much wider spread. But again, I certainly am not the one to say who's telling the truth. But at least it's not. I'm sure neither of them are lying. I'm sure they may have both been true, whatever it is. But I'm just saying it's not such a clear cut. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman said this, and that's the end of it. There's certainly other things that Rabbi Shlomo Zalman said that seem to contradict it. Now. Let's go through a little bit, and this will also trigger your memory from previous classes, of what possible options there could be. So first of all, the question is, can you say mitoich? Can you say that because... Oh, by the way, there's another kuntus I have here. So this is a halachic journal called Vayan Shmuel, which different people contribute towards, and I have here, you can see, probably a 15-page article from a Rabbi Yaakov Cohen, I have no idea who it is, where he also goes through this whole topic of using the hot water on Yom Tov, and he quotes Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he tries to make sense of it this way, that way, the other way, and doesn't come up with anything very good. Then you have, so here, so we try mitoich. What is mitoich? That because it's hutra l'tzorech, hutra shaloi l'tzorech. In other words, you could expand the need when you do, because something is allowed for food items, you're allowed it for non-food items. So there's a number of problems with suggesting that over here. And the main problem is that, like I told you, the example of the oil, you see clearly that mitoich doesn't allow you to do other melachas. It doesn't say that while you're doing something for food, you could do something else. That doesn't compute. Okay? Now, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman himself, Shmir Shabbos Kol Chos himself, in this footnote, refers to Tov Kuf Gimel, to Shulchan Aruch section 503, which is what we spoke about 2 classes ago, that you could fill up, like I mentioned before, you could fill up a pot of water and put it with one act on the fire. So essentially, I guess the argument trying to be made over there is that it's one act. You're turning on the hot faucet. In one act, that introduces no water. So if it's one act, it's all allowed. There's 2 major problems with this. First of all, in the case of the pot, the act that you're doing is a melacha of bishul. I'm putting a pot of water on the fire. In that same act, there is more bishul happening. In other words, I'm not just cooking 1 liter of water, I'm cooking an extra liter of water. Right? Here, the act that I'm doing is nothing. It's not bishul. I'm removing hot water that's already cooked. So what's the basis to say that you could apply that same logic when the original act that you're doing is not a malacha? The allowance is once you're doing malacha, we allow you to do more malacha. Here, you're not doing any malacha, so what's the allowance to say you could therefore do more malacha? That's one problem with that argument. Mm-hmm. The other problem is that it doesn't even match up the scenario, because there you're putting the water in the pot while the pot is off of the fire, and then you're putting the whole pot onto the fire. Here, every speck of water, so to speak, every drop of water that goes into the boiler, it's going directly onto the fire, into the boiling hot water. So how does this work? Okay, so I was looking further, I was trying to find, does anybody else make any sense of this? And I came across an article from none other than Rabbi Heller. Rabbi Heller is the Rav, one of the senior Rabbanim in Crown Heights. And this is an article which Kedarka, he doesn't publish a lot of articles, and even when he does, they're very cryptic and short. But this is an article that he published a long time ago, I think in the 80s. And with this exact question, using hot water on Yom Tov. And of course he quotes this question, this ruling quoted in Shvi Shabbos Kolchasa from Rosh Hashanah, and he's trying to make sense of it. And he says, I have a way to make sense of it. What Rosh Hashanah is saying is that the cooking, the new water that comes into the boiler is machshirei nefesh. It's like your spit. You're not using that water, but it's a necessary preliminary act to be able to use the hot water that you're using now. So it's not eichel nefesh, because you're not using that water, but it's machshir eichel nefesh. It's just like you need a spit to create a roasted meat. You need that gallon of water to be cooked in order for you to be able to extract the gallon and use it in your kitchen. Okay, beautiful. So we have some way of making sense of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. The problem is that if you're going to say that the reason you're allowed to use the hot water faucet on Yom Tov is because it's machshir eichel nefesh, now we have to apply all the limitations of machshir eichel nefesh to using hot water on Yom Tov. So let's go through the limitations. Number one, you were not able to do it before Yom Tov. And you know what, let's do number one and number two together. You were not able to do it before Yom Tov. And also on Yom Tov, there's no other option. Well, let's think. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean a convenient option. No other option at all. Well, let's think about it. First of all, you could have turned off your boiler before Yom Tov. You could have turned off the main into your boiler before Yom Tov. You could have cooked fire on you could cook a pot of water on your fire, and then use that hot water, mix it together with cold water, make warm water, and use that water to wash dishes. Not convenient, but possible, right? So it's certainly far from simple to maintain that there's no other. There are other options. Definitely are other options. Number two, even if for some reason you want to say no, there's no other option, and all the other options have inherent problems with them, there's no other option at all. Okay, so Shlomo Zalman Auerbach could have used the hot water in his house when nobody else was watching, but he can't do it when anybody else is watching, and he certainly can't publish it in a sefer that says you're allowed to do it, because this is our secret. We're not allowed to tell anybody this.
Mm-hmm. What is that called? The secret?
Halacha ve'ein moirin kein. Now you don't know which other things are halacha ve'ein moirin kein, huh? You don't know what other secrets I'm keeping. Okay, now.
Just means we have to keep learning.
Exactly.
Maybe every week.
You have to join the club. Okay. Now. Okay, so that's the first two problems with this. First of all, is it true that there's no other option? Second of all, ein moirin kein. Thirdly, whenever you're faced with two options, one is to do a machshirin and one is to do a eichel nefesh, you have to do the eichel nefesh. One example of this, let's see if we can find this quickly. Right, so for example, if the halacha on Yom Tov is that usually the halacha is you don't turn down the flame on Yom Tov, right?
Right.
You could turn up, right? But what if your food is going to get burned from your food? Then you're allowed to turn down the flame. What if you have another flame? You have a small fire and you have a big fire. So can I go and put my food on the big fire and use that as an excuse to turn it down? So the answer is no. You have to use a small flame. If you don't have a small flame, you can turn down that one. So one of the explanations that halacha seems to be that that when you have a choice between machshirin, turning down a flame is usually associated with machshirin, which gets into the whole thing I mentioned before, that it's not exactly binary. Let's skip the details for now. The point is that when you have a choice between machshirin or actual eichel nefesh, you have to do the actual eichel nefesh. And so even if somehow you're going to say that you couldn't have used the water before Yom Tov, etc. So right now, it's better for you to go and put a pot of water on the fire and use that water to wash your dishes than it is to turn on the faucet, because turning on the faucet is machshirin, and that's the direct eichel nefesh. Now, even if you want to dismiss everything Rabbi Heller has said until now, right? So that would, at the very most, give you the allowance to. Again, I'm not saying I don't agree. I think everything he said until now sounds quite convincing, and maybe I have a confirmation bias because this is what I've been saying for 20 years. But that, yeah, that's what he says. But even if you want to dismiss everything he said until now, so that would mean that if you have your baby bottle that you want to warm up, you would be allowed to turn on the hot water faucet. But if you want to wash your hands with warm water, okay, now I want to point out that when it comes to washing dishes, let me ask you guys. Washing dishes, is that eichel nefesh or is that machshirin?
I thought it was eichel nefesh because it doesn't touch anything.
Do you have any other dishes you can use?
Let's say you don't. Like you don't have any other spit you could use.
And you have to serve more food?
Yeah.
So it's
And have a meal?
So you have a spit. You have no way of cooking your meat. I'm sorry, we're not going to allow you to make a spit. You should have made it before Yom Tov.
It's probably machshirin.
But were the dishes used on Yom Tov, so they got dirty on Yom Tov, so then you couldn't have washed them before Yom Tov?
Fine. So I'm
now
not saying
so
fine. You have to wash them. But is it eichel nefesh or is it machshirin?
It's probably machshirin.
Is it more comparable to cooking food or more comparable to fixing a spit?
Fixing a spit.
Right. So l'chayra washing dishes should be machshirin. That said, it's complicated. There does seem to be implication in the paskim, including the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, that in some places that washing dishes is machshirin, in other places it seems that washing dishes may be actual eichel nefesh. So that remains. Rabbi Heller himself writes Tzarachion. I don't have clarity on which category. Again, logically, washing dishes should be machshirin. There are a number of difficulties with that. Be that as it may. But basically, the bottom line is that certainly for washing your hands, let's talk washing your hands. Washing your hands, we saw before in the Alter Rebbe explicitly, washing your hands with warm water is allowed in Yom Tov under the category of mitoich. That it's not a eichel nefesh, it's non-food need that's allowed. Good, but remember what we said about machshirin? We never allow machshirin for mitoich. Machshirin are only ever allowed for food-related items. So if you're going to base the heter of using the hot water faucet on Yom Tov on the fact that it's machshirei eichel nefesh, so with all the inherent problems in that, at the very most it's going to allow you to turn it on for actual food, for actual to warm up your baby bottle. But if you want to wash your hands with warm water, you can't do machshirei eichel nefesh to wash your hands with warm water. So in that case, it would certainly be forbidden. And so, for me, the takeaway, and again, maybe I should again acknowledge my confirmation bias, but I think that Rabbi Heller is certainly a reliable Rav for me to feel supported by over here. That it seems that doesn't seem to be any legitimate heter to use your hot water faucet on Yom Tov, unless of course you turn it off before Yom Tov or set the thermostat to be lower than Yad Tziledis Boy or something like that. And even if you want to be lenient, at the very most you could be lenient for actual food-related items. Washing dishes may be questionable because, well, if it's machshirin, you could do machshirin, so that's another shayla where you could do machshirin for machshirin. Okay, that's another shayla which we're not going to get into. But certainly for washing your hands and feet in warm water, there doesn't seem to be any basis for heter to use the hot water faucet on Yom Tov. Now it's only 9:01, so if you'll indulge me a few more minutes, I want to touch on another thing which is going to help us for next week's class on showering on Yom Tov. Yes, is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a term we've been using here throughout, and that is shava l'chol. No. Next class. Next class is probably going to be in the beginning of July. We have to get a date. There's a term we've been using here a lot called Shaveh L'chol Nefesh. In other words, it's a universal need. It can't just be, for example, something that only the elite class like to do. The example is mugmar, which is some sort of grilled aroma, spices, which the very wealthy people used to enjoy doing after the meals. That was an example of something which was, that's not Shaveh L'chol Nefesh, that's not called a universal need. So it has to be a universal need. Now, how do you define, we have to define our terms, what is a universal need? Now, there are basically three different ways to determine, to define those words, and all three of these have basis in the Paskim. One way of understanding it is, and this seems to be the way the Sefer HaChinuch in Mitzvah Reish Tzadik Ches number 298 understands it, and that is, it has to be something that everybody does sometimes. Everybody does it with some sort of regularity. This mugmar, this aromatic experience, was something that your average middle-class person never ever did. So that's not Shaveh L'chol Nefesh. But if it's something that everybody does sometimes, then, like, for example, washing your feet. Washing your feet is not something that everybody does every day, but it's something that washing your feet with warm water is something which is a universal need. Everybody does that sometimes. That is considered Shaveh L'chol Nefesh. That's, let's say, a middle approach to Shaveh L'chol Nefesh. A more extreme to the right approach, which possibly may be the way the Alter Rebbe understands it, is that it has to be not just something that people do with regularity, but something that people need with regularity. It has to be able to be defined as a need and not just something that people do. And third option, a little bit more in the other direction, is that even if there are people who never do it, but given the opportunity they would, then it's allowed. So it could be something that only wealthy people do. So the mugbar, this aromatic thing, is something which it's like a learned taste. So regular people, they don't even if you offer it to them, they'll just be like, no, that doesn't seem like an exciting thing to do. But there are other things that everybody would enjoy. It could be that middle class people don't do it because they can't afford to do it, but given the opportunity, they always would. So those are as a brief outline, three different ways to understand what Shaveh L'chol Nefesh means. Now, this was determining exactly what Shaveh L'chol Nefesh means was a very, very hot topic in the early days of smoking cigarettes, which they call it smoking, they call it drinking. The Paskim use all different words for it, because as smoking became more and more prevalent, the question became, is smoking considered Shaveh L'chol Nefesh? Well, does everybody need to do it? Do most people do it? Most people in the city? Most people in this country? In many societies, and I believe this was probably true of frum societies forever, that even in societies where all the men smoked, pretty much, certainly from what I can recall, in places like Antwerp, for example, where you're weird if you don't smoke, none of the women smoke. It's only in the frum community, only the men smoke, right? So to determine exactly what's Shaveh L'chol Nefesh, how many people do it, I think that's one part of the discussion. And then another part of the discussion touches on this Rashi, because there are people who don't, and again, you have to try and put yourself out of today's understanding of the inherent
side effects.
Unhealthy aspects of smoking and etc. But just put yourself in the shoes of a person talking 100, 200, 300 years ago, right? That even in a place where virtually everybody smoked, there were always some people, and I don't know the percentages, but there were some people who not only didn't they smoke, but they didn't like smoking. So it's not like, Rashi says, given the opportunity they would do it. Well, there's always going to be people who beferish don't want to smoke. It disturbs them. So there's a very important Pnei Yeshua, and all of these things are going to come into play when we talk about showering on Yom Tov, because one of the reasons why Shulchan Aruch says that you're not allowed to bathe on Yom Tov is because bathing on Yom Tov is not considered a universal need, and we have to understand why it's not called a universal need and whether that has changed nowadays. But the Pnei Yeshua has a chiddush, which is quoted. Pnei Yeshua is actually it's not really usually quoted as a posuk. He's a commentary on the Talmud, but he often is, and this Pnei Yeshua is quoted widely by the poskim. Pnei Yeshua, if I recall correctly, he's the same time period as the Maggid of Mezrich. I I think we even crossed paths. I was at the Pnei Yeshua's kever he's buried in, I'm pretty sure it's in Frankfurt. So Pnei Yeshua has a chiddush, which is fairly, he bases this on a Tosfos, he doesn't make this up himself. And that is that if there's something that has a health benefit to it, so even though only a few people do it, that is considered Shavah L'chol Nefesh. So his example is, and he doesn't explicitly say that that there's people or most people who don't like smoking, but that's clearly what he's addressing over here. But he says smoking people smoke because it has a health benefit. It helps you have smooth digestion. Now, even nowadays, with all the terrible things about smoking, nobody would argue that smoking does in fact help have smooth digestion. And so, says the Pnei Yeshua, even though, and again, I'm going to paraphrase, this is how I understand the Pnei Yeshua. I think what he's saying is that even though smoking is not Shavah L'chol Nefesh, having smooth digestion is. Right? And therefore, because there is a medical benefit to smoking, that makes it Shavah L'chol Nefesh, even if you want to argue that most people, or many people, don't want it. And by the way, I don't want to get too sidetracked with smoking on Yom Tov nowadays, but I will say that to my mind, of all the different heterim for smoking on Yom Tov, this is the only one, or the strongest one, that may still have validity today. Because even though nobody is going to suggest that smoking is healthy, but smoking does have again, health benefit is the wrong word, but it does have a benefit to the functioning of a person's body in the immediate here and now, that it helps him have smooth digestion. So that is a universal need, which, again, I'm not condoning smoking on Yom Tov, but of all the heterim out there, this is the one that would carry the most weight nowadays when most people don't smoke.
Well, Rabbi Rapoport, there's some teas that help with digestion too. I mean, that are healthy.
So those teas are also Shavah L'chol Nefesh. That wouldn't change the fact that smoking, it doesn't matter. We're not. You have to. I think that people get.
It's and there's another option.
It's not machshira. No,
Right,
it's not
that's what I
machshira
was
l'chol nefesh.
thinking.
It's not machshira l'chol nefesh. You're lighting the fire in the thing that you're actually smoking. It's not food. It's mitoich. By mitoich, it doesn't matter, right? And okay, I didn't understand your question. Yeah. No, if you were lighting something else to light the cigarette, then you would be right. But you have other ways of doing it. But here. The fire. There's other issues with smoking. You're not allowed to extinguish. You're not allowed to, you flick the ashes or things like that. But you're lighting a fire for a bodily need, which is Shavah L'chol Nefesh, and that's the question: is it Shavah L'chol Nefesh? And I think that of all the arguments pro smoking out there, and again, nowadays the problem is that nowadays everybody, feels very uncomfortable with smoking in general, and certainly smoking on Yom Tov, it seems everything. But the problem is that the poskim, even if they would agree with that, a lot of poskim are very hesitant to officially endorse a ban on smoking on Yom Tov, because for so many hundreds of years, all Gedolei Yisrael smoked on Yom Tov. I think there's even a thing I read somewhere about the Rebbe's father smoking during the Seder. Like that was the most appropriate time to smoke. The Seder, you're demonstrating freedom and aristocracy. Like what more appropriate time to smoke than by the Seder? Right now, obviously, to us that sounds so absurd and backwards, but because of that, poskim are hesitant to officially sort of come out there with a ruling that you're not allowed to smoke on Yom Tov. Even the most, one of the most daring poskim, if you will, around today, who's sort of accepted in the Frum world and the Haredi world, is Rabbi Weiss, and he has a tshuva on smoking on Yom Tov, and I don't have it in front of me now to confirm this for sure, but if I recall correctly, he stays a tiny little bit shy of saying it's absolutely forbidden. And I think that if you asked him in private what he thinks, I think he would probably say he thinks it's absolutely forbidden, but he's probably hesitant to publish that because he doesn't want to be sort of disrespectful to all those. And he's not even saying that it was forbidden for them. In those days it was permissible, because in those days it may have actually been Shavah L'chol Nefesh, but nevertheless there's that degree of respect. Okay? That brings us to close today's class. So one more important point to add is that another workaround could be, if you find a legitimate cause to turn on your hot water. For example, let's say you do want to accept that machshirei nefesh should be permissible in this case, and therefore you would allow turning on the hot water to warm up the baby bottle, right? Once it's on, you could leave it running and then use that running water to wash your hands and do other needs as well. So you just need to find, again, I'm still saying that it's difficult to allow it even for that, even for doing the baby bottle. But if you, again, there clearly are poskim out there who allow it, and maybe even have somebody who didn't come to this class who just turned it on for you, whatever it is. So then you could, once the hot water is on, however it got on, you could leave it running. But I don't think that would help in the context of showering, because you're never gonna. There's constantly new water coming in. I mean, I guess eventually if you use so much, then it's not going to be heated instantaneously. Then you're going to use up all your hot water, and then it's not going to be outside that display anymore. And then, okay, but you're going to have other problems then, because first of all, it's certainly not Shabbat l'chol nefesh to stand in the shower for so long, and also by the time also in Shvus Yitzchak he goes through that option, and he points to a number of problems with that option. I don't remember them all offhand, but we know that when we talk about showering in the next class, we'll address those options as well.